Well, it is. So although the theme this year has been trust and transparency, the methodology has really been on building connections with other stakeholders and engaging. So we've had fantastic sessions with the Broadcasting Standards Authority, with a number of corporates, and it's been really good. I've never seen a Privacy Week actually where there have been so many different organisations actively engaged. I'm going to introduce Diane in a moment, but first, in addition to engaging with corporates and with other associations and with other regulators in the area, it's been great to see the launch of a new NGO, and some of you will have had some exposure to this already if you've been along to earlier events, but I'm pleased to introduce my predecessor, Marie Schroff, to tell you about a new important player in the field, which my office is very happy to support, and thanks, Marie, for coming on.
Kia ora koutou, and thanks, John, for giving me a couple of minutes. Now, some of you have already heard this spiel, so I will keep it pretty short. But I just want to take a moment to say, John, I absolutely agree with you about this Privacy Week. I think it's been especially interesting to see so many quite substantial players doing presentations about privacy. So thank goodness, I think the word is finally getting through and people are taking it very, very seriously. So that's great. Well, to help you to take it seriously, perhaps we could have that slide up there. To help you take it seriously, a group of us have launched something called the Privacy Foundation, and this week we thought it was appropriate to launch in Privacy Week, and we have a logo. Everybody has to have a logo, and we've done a bit of research and found that we seem to be the first people in the world to use the I as a person, so a little bit of originality there, thanks to our logo designer, and a website. It's privacyfoundation.nz, so really everything you need to know is on that website, including, for example, the fact that I'm the chair, Dame Sylvia Cartwright is the patron, and the members of the founding committee are a mixture of academics and people in the private sector. And I'm pleased to be able to progress report at the end of this week that I've got a lot of people signing up, so I might start with the pitch and say, please go and click on the join button and sign up. It's only going to be $40 for an individual, bargain basement rate. And someone suggested I should say it's a $500 corporate rate. So, and we also encourage organisations to talk to us about, what we might do and whether organisations can contribute. We already have support from Trade Me and HealthLink, and I'm hoping from OPC, and we hope that there'll be a few others. So, as I say, everybody is taking it seriously. So, what are we going to do? We're going to be a advocate for the protection of the privacy rights of New Zealanders, and our motto will be independent, informed and fair public comment on privacy. Now you might, I don't have to preach to this audience here particularly about why we need that. Obviously we do need more voices in the privacy field, but I should stress that we're a volunteer group, absolutely separate from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, and our views may sometimes differ from theirs, but we do expect most of the time to be complementing the work of the Privacy Commissioner. And our point of difference is that we stand right outside the system. Look, as Privacy Commissioner, I myself would be slightly annoyed to suggest that someone would suggest I wasn't independent and fair. But there are some requirements in the Privacy Act that put some constraints on the Privacy Commissioner. So we can go out there and say some stuff really strongly. And we hope that you will suggest to us topics where we can make a difference because we do have that outside the system status. So join the global movement. We want everyone. You don't have to be an expert. And as I say, you'll find it's really easy to join. The joining mechanism is working. We already have dozens and dozens of people signing up. And our motto, just to finish again on this point, is independent, informed and fair. Thank you very much, John.
Thanks, Marie. And can I just say, what a relief it is to finally have an independent, informed and fair commentator in the privacy space. We welcome the extra voices. Nobody laughed. we welcome the extra voice, and I think it is really important. As I travel around the world, I see really engaged civil society movements which contribute to the public discourse in ways which regulators are not quite at such liberty to do so. So do join up and do disagree with my office. That's important, because at the moment I take a position, I drive my stake into the ground, and it's right out on the edge, and people go, oh, that privacy commissioner, he's a fanatic, it's all about the privacy. So what I need is another stake way over here, which makes me look like the moderate guy. So there's ample roles for everyone. Now everybody's talking about data and releasing the value of it and our rights to it as community. It's our data, particularly government-held data. Government is very keen to realise the value of that public asset and has begun a number of initiatives to try and figure out how to do that, and how to do that in a way that is safe, and how to do that in a way that individuals see the value of rather than necessarily just seeing the threat. One of the ways in which government has gone about that is to establish the Data Futures Partnership, and I won't presume to describe it because that's our guest speaker's job, but Dame Diane Robertson is uniquely positioned to lead not only that organisation but the public conversation around public data use. She has been a city missioner at the Auckland City Mission, is back in her history as a computer programmer, and has combined those skills to add actual empirical data to discussions around poverty and the needs of those most disadvantaged in society. One of the things that the Data Futures Partnership has been tasked to do is to stimulate a discussion about social license. What is good about data use? What is creepy? Are we going to do something for you, or are we going to do something to you? And how do we strike that balance? So I won't presume to encroach on her territory. Dame Diane, please join us and give us the wisdom of your experience leading this conversation in social license. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I might put stakes in the ground in different places.
Yes.
We agree to disagree at various times. Thank you for the invitation to come and speak at this event. It is fantastic to see more and more people engaged in the debates around privacy, and in particular for me, having conversations around how data is used and how privacy and data are related, because not every bit of data that's collected about people comes from giving your consent to give it. And so we need to start thinking about a new way of looking at privacy and a new way of looking at data and social license. The Data Futures Partnership, and I've got the clicker, haven't I? So that's
yes,
mine. Yeah.
that's yours.
Cool. The Data Futures Partnership was set up by the government after the Data Futures Forum. The forum was in place for 6 months, and it was asked to set up and give the government some advice around trusted and value use of data. If we understand that data is very much, and there was an article in the newspaper yesterday, comparing data to oil, and talking about how when we had, we've got this huge amount of oil, regulation around it, who owns it, what is the legislation that needs to be had. And so I think the government's beginning to understand that data is an asset that goes across all of the sectors, and that we need to understand how we can get the best value out of it, but that also how we can make sure it's trusted and it's kept safe, and we respect people's privacy in that process. So that's why we've been set up. We are a group that is independent. I think one of the things that happens a lot, and it's an Auckland-Wellington problem in a way. When I live in Auckland, and everybody thinks that we're an arrogant bunch of people who don't know that there's anything past the Bombay Hills. And I have to say, when I come and work in Wellington, Wellington assumes there's nothing past government data. And it's one of the things we need to broaden our horizons and think about. There's huge amounts of data, there's huge amounts of issues in business, not-for-profits, philanthropy, where data is being used and shared, that actually comes under the auspices of this particular group. So we're not just focusing on safe and valued use of government data. We're thinking about New Zealand's data, and when our data is offshore, how that's shared and the safety and security of that as well. So it's a really broad remit. And you'll see we have a range of people from business, from academic, Māori, and from government. So a broad range of people involved in it. We are, obviously wrong clicker, wrong one. So for us, it's more than just the privacy issue. We see that there's a framework around privacy, around human rights, that actually we all need to understand, and that we need to see how that works with our data use. But we need to actually go beyond that and talk about what we call an issue of social license. So what do I mean when I talk about social license? It's a term that was actually coined by the mining industry, which makes it quite contentious really, because the mining industry said that they went into Indigenous land and had a conversation with their stakeholders, and they got social license to mine the land. We would say possibly it wasn't quite social license as sometimes coercion and bribery, and even the mining industry would say that perhaps it's not a pure social license, but that's where the terminology came from. And most of the international research around social license focuses on that industry rather than necessarily where we have been looking at it in terms of the social sector and business sector. So we're probably broadening the use of social license in New Zealand. Social license is about making sure that we are using data in a way that is trusted, and that we are clear about the purpose of it, and where the population trusts us to be using it in the right way, and we get general consent about it. We have social license for social issues in New Zealand. Some examples of that is, 40 or 50 years ago, on the whole, we didn't agree with divorce. And it was very, very hard to get a divorce. You had to commit adultery, or you had to abandon your partner. And actually, when you talk about privacy of that, they then used to print it in Truth magazine so that everybody knew who had a divorce. But it was really hard, and we didn't actually socially accept it. So the churches didn't accept it. Over the years, we've actually moved really from not even considering divorce, because we now have relationships that are defined in many different ways, living together, civil unions, all sorts of things. So our social license around our concept and understanding of marriage and divorce has changed. Our social license around gay marriage has changed. So we're always having conversations around social issues, and as time moves on, we sometimes change our opinions, and society generally changes where they stand. So when we talked about homosexual law reform, when that first came in, it came in by one vote in government. But actually, and there was a lot of people who were very anti, there were a lot of people who were at the other end, so you had this real polarity of people for and against, and yet over a period of time, we came to a generally accepted consensus of what we think is okay to happen in society. We currently have a couple of issues that we're looking around social license for in the social area, and that is one of them is about the medical use of cannabis. So it's not a fact that you can't do it, it's just about whether we actually agree as a community that's a good thing or not. And the other one is around euthanasia. And because 10 years ago, the whole issue of euthanasia was not going to be discussed. It was, illegal. There was people who were going to prison for it, and actually now it's coming into being discussed in Parliament and having submissions presented about it. And if you did a poll 10 years ago about euthanasia, probably 4% of the population agreed with it, and the polls now are more and more people actually agreeing with it. Social license can sometimes push legislation to change. So actually, social license can, legislation can follow the social license of the population. So when we're talking about that for trusted data use, we need to think about how do we get social license. We have just conducted a piece of work on social license around the country, and we've been going out to citizens of New Zealand to find out how they feel about their data being used, what are the rules they think there should be around it, what do they trust about us, and what don't they trust. We wanted to have a conversation with New Zealanders that was slightly different to the sorts of conversations we often have, or what we often call stakeholder engagement, where we give out a piece of paper with a proposal on it, we ask people for feedback on it, or we go out and we sit in a room and we tell people what we think the position is, and we let everybody go around the room and have an opinion, and then we decide on the opinion. I was reminded yesterday, we've just had a piece of stakeholder engagement in our cul-de-sac around whether we want yellow lines on our cul-de-sac. And we just got the feedback from the council that said there were mixed opinions about this. And most of you said you would rather have a 2-hour limit on parking, that you didn't really want the yellow lines, that maybe you thought there should be residents-only parking. And now that we've consulted, we'll be out next week to put the yellow lines in. It's not what we understood about the social licence about yellow lines. But so being careful that consultation isn't just a process that you've already made your decision, you're going to do it, and then you're coming back. So what we wanted to do was have a real and honest engagement with New Zealanders. So in conjunction with Massey University, who designed the way that we were going to do this, we came up with a way of engaging New Zealanders that's probably slightly different. We went out to 27 different groups of people throughout New Zealand. We had a mixed range of people, from school children to the homeless population in Auckland, to people living in poverty, to what we call, somebody said to me, when I said ordinary New Zealanders yesterday, what did I mean by that? I mean, we went to parents of kindergarten children and said, could you get people to come in and talk about data? Most people were very reluctant to come and talk about data. I'm not sure why. But when we got them into the room, we had this game board. And on the bottom of the board, you'll see on the axis, one axis is benefit, and the other one is trust. Right? So then we read out a scenario to people, and we said, when we've read this scenario, we'd like you to go and stand where you see you will get benefit, and then to tell us what sort of trust you will get. Right? So the first one was, your doctor has just said to you that he would like to share your medical data with specialists, with St John's Ambulance, with the pharmacy, and probably, if we're talking about One Health in Christchurch, 4 or 5 or more agencies. And the reason we want to do that is so that you can get better service when you go to your provider, that your data will be there, and it will cut down on administrative costs. So how do you feel about that? So rather than letting everybody go around the room and change their feelings as you went around the room, we just said, hop on the board and tell us where you would stand. How much value do you see, what benefit, and how much trust do you have in the people looking after your data or the systems? Immediately people started to say, are you talking about me personally, my family, my community? And so we said, you can think about it from any perspective you like, and when we start having a conversation, we'll talk about that. So not surprisingly, really, in that first scenario, majority of people were up in the white corner, which is the highest amount of value or benefit, and they were really trusting. They trusted their GPs in particular to share this data. They trust the medical profession, and I see one or two faces going. But this is where New Zealanders are. They trusted and they thought their data was going to be safe. The second scenario was, if your data was anonymised, would you be happy with it being shared with government, with business, with iwi and community? And we deliberately threw these ones in to say, you know, this data can be shared in all sorts of ways. And we talked about being anonymised, your name and address was taken off it, and you couldn't be identified. How would you feel? And the board in the middle says actually there's a fairly broad sweep, and for every topic it was a broad sweep. A lot of that was because people don't understand what anonymised, what de-identified. I mean, and that's not, I have to say, That's not just the confusion that you find in the general population in New Zealand. It's a confusion in Wellington between government departments and people working in data. The whole understanding of the terminology changes, and people use anonymised and de-identified and identified in the same breath. And so, not surprising that people were slightly confused about what that meant. On the third one, we said, would you be happy with your personal data, with your names on it, was shared with government, community, business, and iwi? And you can have a look where everybody was standing, because we've moved from the big board to little boards, where everybody was standing. Most of them wanted to get off the end of the board. They were sort of leaping right down around here. We don't trust people. We don't trust business. Why would you give it to iwi? How would that happen? So we did that first scenario, and every time we did the scenario, we said we took a photo of the boards. We then went through and said to them, we are writing guidelines for New Zealand about trusted data use. What is it you think needs to be in those guidelines? Okay. So we went through from, the first one was the medical scenarios. The second one was educational data. Would you be happy for your educational data to be shared between schools and you know, the personal data? Would you be happy for anonymised data? And what about if it was personal data that was shared further, so educational data into the health system and things like that? The same sort of places that people stood on each one. Less trust in educational data being shared, which is interesting. And people had a higher degree of trust in their medical practitioners. And that's interesting because it tells you that you can't get social license to share all data. That social license is situational about when you want to do a particular piece of work or a particular thing you want to share. So people had different feelings about different issues. The third one that we did was around the Internet of Things. And we used smart street lighting. And the first one was the street lights are there and they come on when you come close by, and they also have a little warning system in if there's a civil defence. Everybody goes, oh yay, that's great. And then we sort of added a camera in it that was going to measure things, or measuring devices, and they could tell you if it's allergy season, da-da-da. It was pretty cool. Third one we said, and there would be a camera that would take photos, and so it would be able to pick up any crime in the area and things like that. And people immediately went, oh, so I could be identified for speeding. I don't think that's a good idea. so as we went on, we had a similar thing with the Internet of Things and data that wasn't quite so personal, but the same sort of thing. We went through the three scenarios, and on every occasion we asked people to talk about why they were standing where they were standing. And in every group, you'd get at least one person who would be in the bottom of benefit and trust on every scenario. You know, they've got their tin hat on, they've got their antenna out, and all data is bad and everything is evil, and nothing you say would move them from that ever. Other end, you have people who just trust implicitly about everything. But in the middle of that, you've got people who have a really rich understanding of why they want their data to be used in different ways, and a great understanding of it. One of the interesting things was, and it's what I was told a lot when I went out doing this, was that older people have no idea about data and technology, and young people are technically very savvy. Absolutely wrong. Absolutely wrong. Older people are very savvy about their information, because that's what data is. It's information about them. They have experienced life events when their data has been shared, there's been breaches, something's happened, and they worry about themselves being identified, they worry about their children and their grandchildren. Younger people who are technically savvy are very data ignorant. I get great value, therefore I'll give. You know, straight into Facebook, into Google, all the rest of it, and never ever thinking that I'm getting a free service, but actually I'm giving my data. And not a lot of understanding of that. That's one part of it. The other part of it, on the whole, and it's a very broad generalisation because some young people have experienced some big issues. On the whole, they said, I've got nothing to hide, nothing's happened to me, there's nothing to worry about. But then as people in their life stages go, actually, I don't want somebody to know that I had an abortion when I was 17. I don't want somebody to know, I don't want an employer to open up my file and know that I was a failure at school and have that jeopardise my opportunities in the future. I don't want somebody to know that I've got an HIV statement or a status or a mental health one. And mental health was a huge issue for people. So real concerns around that. So what we then said was, what would make you more comfortable about if somebody wanted to use your data for a particular purpose? What are the things that you would want to have done? And so, she says, clicking. Okay. So what is the things that they actually said? The first one they said is they want there to be a clear purpose. Now we've had a really good example recently where there's been a real pushback from the not-for-profits about a request for data from MSD. And there has been a report from the Privacy Commissioner around that as well about whether it's actually breaching people's privacy. But what we would say is in terms of social licence, there was never a really clear purpose for why this was going to be collected. A broad statement of, this is for better service development, or this is for your own good, actually isn't enough of a purpose statement, being very, very clear. Understanding the value. What is it that you are going to get out of my data, and what is it that I am going to get? If you use my data, and I'm giving you permission to use it, what is the value? And people are very aware that the value might be that I might personally not get a great deal of value out of something, but my family might, or my community might, or the nation might. And they were actually people were really making those trade-offs between what is good for the country, what is good for my community, and what would I compromise over for that particular thing. The control of the data. One of the issues and for us has been, and it's come up time and time again from people, is that they're really concerned about the accuracy of the data that's held about them. And we've had a couple of examples recently. One has been in child, youth and family, where a person was, it was written in the files that he was a paedophile and he'd been in jail when in fact he hadn't been. And he tried to correct it and went on for a very, very long period of time, and it wasn't corrected. People understand that maybe you've got something that is not correct about them, but they want the right to go in and correct it. They want the right to actually have a process for how that will be done. Now, I know from the agencies that I've worked in, we've had complaints processes, we've had reviews around how people could get hold of their data, but I've never had a process that says, if you say the data is incorrect, I have a process for actually sorting that out with you. I may have a disagreement with you about it, but I have a process for looking at that, I have a process for remediating it, and I have a proof process to say that I've actually done it, and it can be very clearly seen and followed. So I think that's one of the things that people were really asking for in this process. Security, people do not really believe that their data can be anonymised. The general public of New Zealand do not believe it. They do not believe that it's safe. And the more involvement they have with government, the less they trust that. And they will always come out with the times it hasn't been kept safe. So we get ACC, the kiosk breach for MSD, the current one for MSD. So they are called out all the time about how they can prove that the data hasn't been kept safe. And they would also say, when those breaches have happened, agencies and government have not dealt with it well. They haven't said, yes, it's happened, we're sorry, this is the process, it hasn't been followed, we will make sure this is how we remediate it. Once again, it's taking responsibility. Can we be 100% sure that data will stay anonymised? And I would say, actually, we can't be. We can't be. So we need to start thinking about what does security mean. It came up particularly with vulnerable populations who were concerned that people had access to their data who shouldn't have access to their data. So they wanted to know who was allowed access to the data, who would be handling it, who would be viewing it. So clear and transparent around it. The transparency, I think, goes across all of those ones. You know, if you have a purpose, if you are showing value, if you're demonstrating what the use is for, and if you are talking about the security, then you get transparency. One of the issues, and it's interesting that there's been a not-for-profit starting privacy organisation, is there has been a real call from people and from the New Zealand public to have an independent body that gives oversight to data. And it came up all the time. Who is the person you would go to around this? And time again, people said to us, we have had an issue. We didn't know whether we should go to the Privacy Commissioner, to the Human Rights Commissioner, and how, and they get bounced around and they're not sure. And so there isn't some need for clarity about, if it is a data issue that goes to the Privacy Commissioner, it's like, how do you do that and what do you do? But people are asking for a governance organisation that actually provides that as well. It was interesting, I think it's interesting in terms of that we don't necessarily think we need to go out and talk to people about social licence. Organisations in Wellington think they can give themselves social licence to do things. So if they follow the rules, they get social licence. There is a thing called social licence to operate, and that's you get sort of a general permission to do what you're doing. But actually social licence for particular pieces of work. Now we're not saying that every time you want to do something, you've got to go out and get social licence. Social licence is when you're doing something different, something novel, and something that may affect a particular group of people in a way, so particularly marginalised people. So when we have these guidelines, you will be able to tick, so I want to use this data, and it will be specifically for a small group of marginalised people, tick. It will be a new use of data, tick. It will be a novel use, tick. Then you need social licence. If you don't tick those boxes, then you can probably use your data for the purpose, any purpose without that. So just thinking about when you have to get social licence, and it's a question that comes back to me all the time. The discussions, and the other thing I think we need to remember is actually we don't often go far enough when we start to talk about seeking social licence or engaging people. It is not enough to engage stakeholders in government. It is not enough to engage the NGO sector as if they were the answer to everything. There is quite a very clear difference between what NGO agencies think about sharing data and what clients think about sharing data. They have quite different perspectives. And so we need to be very clear about who is this data going to be used for, what is the purpose of it, and who is it going to affect the most. It may have an effect on not-for-profits, but actually not-for-profits are, in effect, representing a large group of clients. We need to talk to them. We went to the homeless population in Auckland, and it was quite an experience really, because Massey University had never engaged with this particular group of clients, and I said in the first place that you never buy enough food. And I think they took me literally, and they bought stacks of food back. It's never enough. You just, they just have to take away a lot of doggy boxes from doggy bags from consultation with homeless people, because they need to stock up on their food while they're there. They are amazing. And I think they just sort of blew everybody out of the water around us, is because they straight away said, how are algorithms going to be used? We hear that parole could be done by an algorithm. And so how will that work? Do we have any input into that? And what happens, Diane, If the algorithm says I shouldn't be released because I'm a really, really bad person and everything says that, but last week I found God and I'm moving on with my life. Where does the human story get put with the data? And that's part of the social license issue that's coming. And so they came up with time and time again. They were probably the group that understood the most about data use, how it's affected them, their concerns about being in the system, their concerns about data being used negatively against them all the time. And one or two of them had degrees and one of them had a PhD. So we should never underestimate the people who we think we're going to use data again. We never underestimate their ability to engage with us in a conversation about what we want to do with their data. And you will be surprised that actually if you said, actually, guys, an algorithm may actually give you a better shot at parole. Because if it's going to be about every single probation officer making a decision about you, if it's going to be based on people's personal values and perceptions, you may get a worse deal. So who knows? And there's certainly been shown in some of the work with case management of young children at risk, where successive social workers have actually just compounded the problem right through, whereas some of the really good data may have made that a much better thing. But we need to think about combining data with our personal experience and knowledge and skills. And this is, I think, what makes social license different, is that you're actually engaging the people that it's going to be about. You're thinking about the effect on them, you're discussing it with them, and then they will be coming up with the issues around the way that they think that they want it to be used safely. Our role is to develop a set of guidelines, and we are in the first draft of that at the moment. And effectively what we think it's going to look like, I was told I wasn't allowed to say what I say it's going to look like and what I think it's going to look like, is actually something that you can have on a website that actually says, if you click on to purpose, if you want to get social license, then go through the cycle of what the things you need to look at. If you want to go about purpose, you start to, these are the things that you need to do. This is how you need to determine purpose. This is the things you need to clarify. If you want to talk about control, if you're going to be using anonymised data, what does this mean? What guarantees can you give to people around that? If you want to talk about personal data, how should you talk about that with people? And so that we have a really clear understanding of what we're going back to people to talk about. When we think about value, what are the things that you need to think? The value to yourself as an organisation, the value to individuals. How do you define what value is? And so you can immediately start to think of some of the issues that you might have. And in MSD at the moment, we're working together to go through and go, if we were going to ask NGOs for information, how are you really clarifying what the purpose is? Have you got a minimum viable product that you're using? Because it's not just a data grab, it's like being really clear about what data you need to perform that job. What is the value? Is it just a value in terms of funding people? Is there a value to clients or not? So each of these steps will have drop-down boxes telling you how to go out. And at the top there'll be a box that says, do you think you need to go out and seek social license on this particular issue? And a series of questions that will drop down. These will in the end be voluntary because they are guidelines. We are at the moment getting a lot of people who are ringing us up, and government departments who are calling us up and saying, we want to go out and do something with our data, there's a particular purpose we want to use it for, can you advise us with how you would think about going out to the public to talk about this? There's been some really good examples of when it's gone wrong, and when people have obeyed all the rules. And I'll talk a little bit about there was a piece of work done by one of our board members, in fact, on predicting risk of children being harmed. And she got sign-off on ethics, she got sign-off on privacy, she got sign-off on human rights, she got sign-off from Maori consultancy group. And she could do it, and technically everything was fine, and then social licence wasn't given by the population, and a headline comes out that the ministers say we're not going to use children, New Zealand children, as lab rats. So, in a sense, what I'm saying is you can tick all of those other boxes, and if the population says we don't want this, there can be huge pushback and we can get stopped in doing the work we want to. But actually, at the end of the day, it's people, their data, and we're going to be using it for people. It's not an innate thing that we can just manipulate and do what we like with. We're going to use it to provide better outcomes for people, better businesses, better ways of funding, all of those things. If we want to get that value, then we need to remember, in order to do that, we need to ensure we're meeting the privacy legislation, the human rights legislation, the ethics, and all the legal things we need to, and then to ensure that we have social licence as well. So thank you. Any questions? Quite happy to try and answer them.
Don't take me first if there's somebody else.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
I'm just interested in your use of the term social licence because, you know, as a sort of long-term public servant, I'm very familiar with the term social contract, you know, implied social contract. It does strike me that social licence is one-sided. You know, it's about what the government wants. Whereas a social contract implies a two-sided relationship where, you know, you're taking something from someone, but in return you're given whatever it may be, in this case, strong assurances. So
You see, I would look at the terminology completely around the other side. I would go to the contract, social contract opportunities, what the government wants. So we might...
the point is, though, you know, where is the two-sidedness here?
Well, the two-sidedness is actually, in order to have social licence, you have to get permission, you have to get the buy-in of the public to do it. So that's quite different to what's normally happening.
Okay, but there's no return assurances there that are given. You just do the work and then you say, okay, we've now got social licence. Is that?
No, I think you've got to continue. Social life, you don't get it and keep it. If you don't contain trust and control and do what you said you're going to do with it, and you don't have value, you can lose it. People will say we're not going to have this continuing to happen. So, and I think part of that loop is you don't just get it, you've got to keep going back to that community and engaging with them. And often with a contract that doesn't happen either. So you take your point, and probably we need to think about that in our loop of doing it. Another question?
Yeah, I was looking at this emerging themes, and I was thinking about risk.
Yeah.
Because risk is somehow on the other side of the coin in trust. When you trust somebody, you're just risking something by giving him, at this example, your data. And whether there should be some risk in these things, and whether that something which can be considered is something which is called, or maybe called safety net, or safety net. That it was seen in banks, in credit cards, when it's easier to get into a trust relationship or relationship with somebody, because trust is a process as well. It's a relationship that you are entering into some conversation, into some relation with other, and you can trust more if you are satisfied with the other side previous performance. And this safety net would be, and risk is a factor, and safety net is something which makes you safe, makes you feel safe that when the other party breaches the trust, you can revert to some safe position.
Yeah.
And this is something which could be very helpful in promoting trust.
Okay, it's a good idea. Yeah, good thinking about that.
Different question. A license sounds kind of very clear and binary. I know whether I've got my driver license or not. I know whether I've paid for a dog license or not. You know, it's kind of very concrete and time box for that matter. How a public consultation process for argument's sake, whether it's done in this design thinking way or a more traditional way, typically isn't binary. It comes back with a mix of results.
Yes, it does.
Including you people who are always going to be in that very dark corner. So how do you know that we have social license to take this next step, or that we've lost social license?
Well, I think if you looked at some of the ones in terms of when we first did our boards, if I can get back to the first did our boards, you pretty much know when you haven't.
It's going to by the numbers?
But it's a bit, and I go this, and number one, I take the thing about the terminology, I get that, but we were given it, when you're given something, you're not going to spend your time.
But I'd be intrigued to know whether your guidance will include some kind of guidance around how to know, when you've got a mix of results from the process.
And in fact, some of that, and we've got a major piece of work that's come out of Massey University, so that will be forming the back of it. So when you start to look at that, you will see some of those things of when we know. There will be always some people who will never, and you just got to be, you're never going to satisfy those people.
Yeah.
So
the other risk, I think, in a consultation process is getting the design of it right so that you're asking the right questions. So sometimes getting a negative result may mean you actually ask the wrong question.
Look, and I have to say, in terms of, we've also got a consultation stream with Maori going at the moment, and they went, these are all the wrong questions.
Yeah.
But that's not unusual. And people would debate the questions, and in the end we said, actually what we're trying to do is look at personalised data in a closed network, anonymised data spread out further, and personalised data used broadly. So it really didn't matter about the thing, because the conversation was actually more important than the topic itself. And we got that stuff coming out all the time. Yeah. So I think we were quite satisfied that we could have done 1,000 different topics. We could have got different scenarios, and we argued long and hard about them, but we wanted to do sort of government and then the Internet of Things, if we could do it. On top of that, we have been asked to do social licence about social investment, and that's another work stream that we're working on for the government at the moment. But it's very hard to go to public and ask them about social licence for social investment, particularly in the political climate. The NGOs were pretty hard to convince around that.
Is this social license a concept that is over and above the Privacy Act, or is the social license, could it be considered as a permission within the Privacy Act?
And I think that's one of the things that we actually have to start. It's not an either or. I would be thinking that probably if you were going out with a new and novel piece of use for data, you would actually make sure that you've ticked off all your legislation boxes anyway. And
you could be consistent with the Privacy Act,
yes,
and still lack social license.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I get a complaint and a data user says, "But we got social license," I'll say, "Well, how nice for you, but I have a statutory process that I'm now going to go through, which may have consequences if this process has caused some harm."
And so it would be in the guidelines. It would be make sure that you've got, you've met this, you've met this, you've met this, and then there may be still something that's contentious in terms of using that you need to go out and get some things in. Yeah. And it's not a license that lasts forever, and it will change, and it will be. But once again, you have to decide when you need to go out and get social license.
I guess, how does it change? Because when you have obtained the social license, you said if you want to do something new, then you need to go out.
You need to go out. You need to go out again.
So it sounds like the social license just continues to expand.
Yes.
So it never, you don't go out if you say, I want to continue doing this. Can the social license be revoked?
If people don't feel that they're getting the value, if you don't meet all those requirements, people may revoke it. People could say, I'm not going to give you my data anymore because you're not showing value, you're not being clear, there's no control over it, those sorts of things. So it can be revoked.
Or you might do something completely unrelated to that piece of work.
Yes.
It goes very badly wrong, and it could have an effect.
Yes. Yeah.
So on top of the general social license, would every individual need to consent for their records to be shared?
That's a really big discussion point because there are times when we don't necessarily give consent, that we are obliged to give data. There are times now when we are giving data all the time in terms of photographs and swipe cards and all sorts of things. So the issue of consent becomes a little bit more blurred around that. Yeah. We were having a discussion around that with business today in particular. Yeah. So my answer to that is I don't know the answer to that question.
The answer to that is it depends.
Yeah. Thank you, John.
I think probably a very good example of that last point is that the New Zealand Cancer Register, the information from cancer testing is it's mandatory for that to be entered onto the New Zealand Cancer Register, and that is one of the national collections which sits within the integrated data infrastructure, which researchers can get access to and do very valuable public health research and link it to other parts in the IDI, other data sets, but there's zero consent is required for that to happen. Yeah. One of my big concerns is around transparency and how people, so if you assume in that scenario that there is a social license needed for that and there's no consent, then at the very least I think we need to work on increasing transparency around that, and that's quite difficult in terms of the depth to which you communicate that sort of conduct to the general public.
And I think that actually, even if you don't do the other steps, because you're allowed to do it, purpose and value. You know, why are we doing this and what are you going to get out of it? Actually, most New Zealanders think that government data is all together and it's all in one big pile and it's all shared between everybody. That's the assumption of most New Zealanders.
Well, if there's no other questions, shall we wrap up?
We shall.
Do you mind just scrolling to your general themes, your last slide? The emerging themes. Because I was really struck in that presentation, and thanks so much, Diane, for sharing findings. Just how consistent these themes, which have been generated from these workshops from...
And I'm sorry, and 4,000 people online as well.
4,000 people. All these people have come up with these ideas, these general themes, which are entirely consistent with privacy values and which are reinforced and supported in our current regulatory framework. So, you know, that tells me, you know, that we've got some of our settings consistent with community expectations. But also, the diversity of views, it tells us that there is no right answer, that this is entirely contextual and subjective. If I point to our logo here and say, what is this about? What are we symbolising here? Half of you might see a lock which is protecting personal information. The other half might see a keyhole through which to peep. and it just, you know, I think it just shows that we bring our own experiences and our own expectations and prejudices and anxieties to these conversations. But I think that the work of the Data Futures Partnership is really important, and we're really happy to support it because we need to have more sophisticated conversations around some of this stuff. And I think, Diane, coming on and sharing the findings of your study with us has been a really important contribution to that. Can I just say, before I invite you to show your appreciation for Diane's presentation, that it's not only Privacy Week, it's Diane Week. It's Diane's birthday, wedding anniversary, and Mother's Day. So let's give her a big hand for all of those. Thank you. Have a good privacy year.